Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael O'Rourke, and I am the director of the MSU Center for Interdisciplinarity. We're the unit that runs the MSU University Interdisciplinary Colloquium. And today is another series of UIC presentations. And we're really grateful to you for making the time to join us today. I will be introducing our speaker here in a moment, but first I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize Michigan's 12 federally recognized Native nations, historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences. In a moment, I'll put in the chat links to additional information about this land acknowledgement and its background. So if you want to follow it up and learn more about it, then you can. As I mentioned, this is the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium. So for those of you who are new, first-time attendees, welcome. We're really pleased to have you here with us. The UIC has been a feature of what the Center for Interdisciplinarity does since its inception back in 2017. We've been running about 6 presentations a semester, every semester since then. And it's the point of the Colloquium series is to provide a forum for faculty and staff across MSU who are doing engaging interdisciplinary work, especially interdisciplinary work that involves humanistic and artistic perspectives. So the Center for Interdisciplinarity is committed to emphasizing and championing the roles that arts and humanities can play in interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary projects. So at major research universities like Michigan State, often cross-disciplinary work generally is work that focuses on the STEM disciplines, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics disciplines. But what gets lost is the fact that artists and humanists also do significant and substantial interdisciplinary work. And so this forum is really designed to amplify and celebrate the innovative interdisciplinary work that artists and humanists do. We meet every other week in the semester. So well, I guess we're going to skip a week because it was going to be spring break and now it's not really spring break, but whatever. The next UIC will be on the 19th of March. From 12 to 1 on Zoom. So I think this link is the same link that will work for the next talk. Our presenter then will be Young Jun Kwok, who is the 2020-2021 College of Arts and Letters Artist in Residence in Critical Race Studies, based in the Department of Art History and Design. And they will deliver a presentation entitled Spartan Skin, Impressions from the Symbol of Campus Pride. So that'll be on the 19th of March from 12 to 1. We encourage you to join us for that if you are available and interested. Today, we're really excited to have with us Professor Johanna Schuster-Craig. I first met Professor Schuster-Craig in a masterclass that C4I ran and was very impressed by both the perspective, cross-disciplinary perspective that she has, and also the work that she's been doing on integration, which lines up with some of the things that the Center for Interdisciplinarity is really interested in and understanding. Professor Schuster-Craig teaches in the German Studies and Global Studies programs at Michigan State University. She's working on a book about integration politics, German media, and the far right, and she has published multiple articles on mass market paperbacks, elite right-wing female politicians, integration politics, youth social work projects, and artist responses to integration politics in Berlin. Dr. Schuster-Craig also has written several articles about Angela Merkel for The Conversation and about historical analogies and memes for the Swiss blog History of the Present. This blog post was a post written in collaboration with Johannes von Moltke at the University of Michigan. She tells me that she'll write a blog post about nearly anything, and that she has lots of opinions about discipline and disciplines, which makes her just the perfect speaker for this series. And today, Dr. Schuster-Craig is with us to deliver a talk entitled Additional Training and Developmental Editing for Transdisciplinary Projects. Dr. Schuster-Craig.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and I'm so excited. Actually, this is such a friendly audience. I can see all of your names, and I know so many of you, and I'm so glad to see you here. I am going to share with you a PowerPoint, and I'm going to try to stay in that PowerPoint just so that the visuals are present. But boy, PowerPoint and Zoom are not the friendliest of guests. So today I want to talk about how I came to the kinds of methods that have really made it possible and helped me to be able to do what I want to do. And this has required some additional training, and that's partially what I'm going to talk about today. But also it just requires a certain kind of headspace in which you can think through how to achieve your goals in terms of constructing a research project. Now, I am not an expert in any way, shape, or form on theories of transdisciplinarity or theories of interdisciplinarity. I've learned everything by trying to do it and trying to apply it. So I'm only going to speak here from the position of someone with applied knowledge. And then I also just, all of us have different temperaments, and my temperament is essentially that of an improviser. But I don't think improvisation by itself is enough. You can't just go in and wing it all the time. If you also know me, you know that I'm a very strong planner and that I like plans. So from my perspective, if you improvise as kind of your approach to material, that also requires a really substantial amount of reflection that comes as the second half of that iterative process. Mostly when I think about learning new methods, I'm not thinking about this in any kind of like meta or intensely zoomed out perspective. Learning new methods for me is always about how do I get the skills to do what I want to do, right? If I have an idea or I have a project, usually that's going to come to me in a form of, oh, that would be cool, or I'd like to do this. And then I have to think through what kind of skills I would need to garner in order to do so. And that's been no different from my book and no different for different kinds of articles or learning how to write for a public audience. All of those things have had the object in the forefront. I want to do this. And then the thinking about methodology comes through the process of trying to execute whatever it is that I'm trying to do. I'm going to talk primarily about my book project today. If you know anything about anthropology, which is one of the disciplines that I take a lot of inspiration from, even though I am not trained as an anthropologist, the anthropologists often talk about how you need to take your theory from your object, right? Whatever is in front of you needs to be the inspiration for the framework that you apply in order to understand it. And integration politics is a form of politics and policy making. So Politik, if you talk about Integrationspolitik in German, the Politik means both politics proper and kind of the negotiation of lawmaking, as well as the policies that arise from that political process. Integration, which I have in scare quotes because it's such a culturally informed term, the integration of immigrants really is about how do we bring immigrants into all areas of social, political, and cultural life? How do we incorporate people into the systems that govern society? The connotation of integration is not quite as generous as that in a German political context, but that's the problem, that's the object that I am interested in. How do we incorporate people into new systems? In a German context, this comes with lots of different keywords: gender, Islam, race and racism. I focus primarily in terms of cultural objects on social work and media scandals, but we also need to think about the ideologies about race in the far right, refugee processing, refugee incorporation, and then all of the processes of resettlement that go along with that. We need to think about how that goes or how that fits into a longer German history and longer conceptualization of German national identity. We need to think about what that means for migration policy as well as resettlement policy. And then all of that is always embedded within a context on which party politics, party platforms, and journalistic attention play really foundational roles in communicating how all of these things work to a broader German national audience. So I didn't really understand that integration was what I was looking at when I started working on stuff in a graduate perspective, when I was a graduate student. At that point, based on what I was reading in my training, I really thought that I was looking just at identity politics. And it wasn't until I had a fellowship and I was in Germany for an extended period of time as an adult that I started to realize, oh my goodness, I've only been concentrating on a tiny, tiny, tiny part of this politicized, deeply politicized process. This really is a transdisciplinary object that spans wide breadths of German society and can influence everything from how people interact with each other in daily life to the laws that are made to govern refugee resettlement or immigrant enculturation. So those were really profound experiences that I had at the beginning of this project that really made it clear to me that I was going to need a lot of skills if I really wanted to delve into this. In order to understand that, it might be helpful for you to know how I was trained. I have a BA in theater, where I had a minor in German. I did not plan at all to become a German professor. That was not on my trajectory. I really thought that I would probably become an experimental theater director. And then I realized that I definitely like eating and I don't like big cities. And so those two things make it very difficult to pursue a career in experimental theater production. But that training was actually quite helpful. I got the opportunity to learn skills about literary analysis. I was writing analytically for theater history classes, but I was also writing creatively to produce pieces and to come up with new projects. You learn a lot about how to meet a deadline in a theater program. There's no second chance. You don't get to push shows back when that show goes up. You better be ready. And one of the things that I think was really helpful for me is that we did a lot of critique of performance. So that was part of our acting classes. Those were part of our production classes. That critique really prepared me well for graduate school and for being able to also assess people's behavior in context. While I was doing that, I was also teaching a lot of community-based theater classes. That's where I got my start in pedagogy. And I did a lot of student activism. I ran a theater company. I also ran domestic violence projects, anti-domestic violence projects, let's be very clear. And I had this kind of applied knowledge from running some very large campaigns and very large organizations about how activist or artistic movements work. And that applied knowledge was very helpful, especially when I started moving into looking at social work projects in Germany. My PhD was in German cultural studies. That's how the Duke program was set up at that time. And I also had a certificate in feminist theory. I learned a lot of different skills that were especially text-based in that program. A lot of information came to me from feminist theory, from the women's studies program, which is where I really did receive most of my mentoring. I had committee members from a variety of fields. My chair was actually in Turkish studies. I had other members from German studies. I had a German historian. And then I also had someone who was trained in Germanistik, which is the German literary category for scholars from Germany. So I had a German scholar also as an outside reader. And then while I was there, if Tina Camp had not suggested to me that I really needed to get some training before going off to do field work, I probably wouldn't have understood that that methodology was going to be critical for me doing the project that I wanted. And I mention that only because it's really, really important to have people on staff that also can spread, especially for interdisciplinary PhD projects, can spread knowledge about how to garner those skills to the students that are working with them. Certainly no one in German studies truly understood that this is what I was going to need to do, and she did. So I ended up getting extra training in documentary methods because the Duke University has a center for documentary studies that is kind of a standalone center and has produced a lot of really interesting radio, photography, artistic, and then also film documentary work. And they offer a certificate in documentary studies. Now, I didn't have time to do the whole certificate, but I definitely took 3 or 4 classes with that center, and that was absolutely critical for understanding the kinds of community engagement that I wanted to do, but also giving me a tool set to be able to do that. When I went to Germany to do my field work, and I was somewhere in between being a documentarian and doing anthropological fieldwork, in that I was doing participant observation, I was an intern at an organization. I was also, looking at archival research based on the kind of documents that they had, but also what appeared also in like the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, the city library. So I don't necessarily feel like I was one or the other, but I was participating in a variety of tasks that were designed to provide straightforward information about what I was looking at and how people were interacting with each other. That happened for me during 3 semesters where I was in residence at the Center for Interdisciplinary, I'm mixing my languages here, the Center for Interdisciplinary Women's and Gender Research, CIFC, the Zentrum, at the TU Berlin, the Technical University of Berlin. And Sabina Hark was my host there. Sabina is a well-known feminist sociologist who has worked a lot on queer theory and bringing queer theory into a German context. And Sabina ran this colloquium that was transdisciplinary in nature. That's what it was called. It was called a transdisciplinary colloquium. And we had everyone participating in there was trained in different fields, right? So one person was writing about robots and somebody else was writing about other various projects, like how diseases are photographed. I think about that person's project in the context of the pandemic a lot, because we are all very familiar with these photographs of COVID now. And I really learned a lot about how different training backgrounds led to approaching different kinds of subject matter. In terms of the kinds of data that I gather, I look at all of these different categories. So I look at media if it's relevant to integration politics, no matter what form it's in. So if that's a TV movie, or if that's newspaper coverage, or if that's a book for popular audiences, or there's a podcast, or there's a really prolific tweeter, all of those are fair game for me because all of them contribute to this overall discourse of integration. Theory for me is really important because if I'm going to look at social developments, I actually need to have frameworks, and I can't develop all of these frameworks myself. None of us do. So I read a lot of theory, both out of a German context and out of a US or North American context, that focuses on all of these things that were part of the nexus of integration politics anyway. I conduct qualitative interviews with social workers. I tend to embed with projects and do a fair amount of participant observation of their programming, but then I do individual one-on-one interviews with people while they're working at that project or in that organization. And then I think it's really important to emphasize that I'm looking at 2 different national traditions of secondary literature. So the way that people write about race and ethnicity or migration and difference in the United States and in Germany, foundationally different. The racial hierarchies are not the same. They don't map onto each other. The far right is not treated the same way in both countries based on different national histories. The construction of white supremacy, the construction of whiteness, is radically different in both places, although obviously it's still based on a coloristic scale, right? So there are real reasons, if I'm coming from one national context, to make sure that I'm deeply familiar with this other national context and the kinds of intellectual production that's happening in that context. In order to do all of those things, I cannot emphasize how important it is to have really strong foreign language skills. If I did not speak German well, there is no way anyone would accept me in any of these situations. They would not be able to have a friendly conversation with me and then test me out to see if I'm appropriate for the venue or see if I'm appropriate for embedding in a certain project. I would not be able to get the kinds of in-depth interactions that I can have when I can converse with someone in their own language. I would not be able to do the archival research that I need, and I would not be able to read the scholarship in that different national context. So foreign language skills for this kind of work are absolutely critical, and there's no way around it. You have to put in the effort. And I think you really need to be able to live abroad for at least 2 years of that adult period. The longer, the better, but that's not always an option for all of us. Residency permits are real. I do a lot of things across these data sets. So I might be historicizing a tweet or an event. I might be analyzing the discourse of a podcast or a historical narrative. I might be applying ethnography to just be existing in this country. Like I might be talking about a walk that I took to describe place and really root the reader in that place. I might need to apply theory across any of these categories. I use theories of discourse, but I also use theories of gender and theories of gender presentation, gender performance. All of those things can be really helpful for illuminating different parts of what I call the integrative apparatus. And then I need to have some ideas about framing. How am I going to frame any of these discussions so that a reader can follow it? I will say that my graduate training, if I had just stayed in German, would have been insufficient to do this project. I needed to learn additional methods. There's different ways I could do that as a graduate student. Part of it meant taking classes, extra classes sometimes in the women's studies program or in Turkish studies. It also meant spending time during the summers, taking those classes at the Center for Documentary Studies, or going abroad for extended periods of time, like spending 15 months in Berlin and really just committing to that immersion environment. So it's not just what you do in coursework here, it's all of the things that are also around it and that you commit to. One of the things that was really helpful for me was developmental editing. And there's a whole industry of folks who have either been trained in publishing or who have worked with writers coming up. They may be scholars themselves. They may have PhDs, but then have gone into publishing. There's a whole host of backgrounds that people have before they enter developmental editing. I ended up working with a historian of science, and I found developmental editing to be really, really helpful in helping me think through how I wanted to structure a project that was this complex. And developmental editing is really a back and forth where you basically are working with a writing coach that understands how to construct a book, in particular, in my case, that gives you feedback on your writing, but that also might teach you how to wordsmith or edit or structure your writing. For me, it was also critical that the outside reader had more information about how to access the publishing industry because they had worked in it for a really long time. So I needed that kind of information about how to pitch my book and how to go through the process of sending out those kinds of packets of information to publishers. One of the real outcomes of developmental editing that was great for me was just having a new approach to structure. So the first materials that I sent to my developmental editor were basically organizing my data by method. And this was very much in line with how I had organized my dissertation, which is pretty appropriate for organizing a dissertation. But it's not very interesting as a book, right? If you're not a specialist, that's not going to really grab someone and make it an interesting reading experience. The second idea was to really adhere tightly to chronology and to organize my book chronologically. But even that, the kinds of things that I was looking at, pure chronology was also not going to work for making the connections that I wanted to make. And so the final idea that I came up with and that my developmental editor also really was into was to have these back and forth chapter pairs, that one set of chapters is really focused on the contemporary moment. And then another set of chapters is doing a historical narrative to really put those moments, those contemporary moments, into historical context. Now, this is in German mostly, partially because I made this for a different presentation, but I just want to show you that this is kind of the structure as it looks now. K, Kapitel, that means chapter in German, so the K is basically chapter. And then you have at the top a bunch of media events and scandals that really illuminate different levels of right-wing discourse. And at the bottom, you have kind of these periods of German migration politics that change over time, but really map on pretty well to the contemporary moments or give context to those contemporary moments. And the idea is truly that these things then meet at the end, right? That you have this present line and you have this past line, and that those come to some kind of synthesis at the end of the, if you've submitted to reading all 8 chapters, that goes somewhere. In terms of the narratives that I'm crafting, one of the things I had to learn how to divide up and how to approach differently was how to close read a performative event like the Sarrazin scandal, how to frame a historical narrative and really walk people through the steps that might have happened over time. And then also, how do I incorporate the ethnography or the ethnographic research that I've done? How do I relate that to analyzing cultural objects and historical frameworks? In terms of input, I can't stress this enough. if you want to do a project like this where there are this many balls in the air, you have to read widely. You have to read all the time. You have to read history. You have to read theory. You have to read your own writing multiple times. You need to be aware of the literary production so that you understand what's happening in a cultural sphere, theater, film, all of those things. You can't do something like this without massive amounts of input because you need to be synthesizing a lot of information. I will say that there are some legibility issues with these types of projects that I've come up with over and over again. I think there's a real tension between the social science and the humanities, which I find strange because really we're interested in a lot of the same questions. But the disagreements about methods between humanities scholars and social science scholars and what those methods tell us and how they can be applied, that tension is really, really strong. Something I don't hear as much now, but that I definitely heard during my first couple of years at MSU was this concern that pre-tenure faculty, if they did an interdisciplinary project, might come up short in terms of disciplinary knowledge. First of all, I don't know how that's possible. I mean, the amount of reading and understanding of the subject field that you have to do a project like this is so massive that I don't think you can escape the discipline. But I also always found this amusing. So German studies is not a discipline. It's a made-up construction that comes out of the intense need for us to understand Cold War division and create area studies programs. There's no there. There's no discipline to be reproduced or discipline to be done. If you go to the German Studies Association conference, we do everything. We do film, we do literature, we do history, we do medievalism. People do political science. There are social scientists that come to the German Studies Association conference. So to me, this is a very bizarre conception to have. I think what it really represents is that there's a dominance of literary studies in German studies, and that has historical precedent. That doesn't have to be how we continue. That doesn't have to necessarily be the future. The other thing that I think is really critical for us to look at is that we may give lip service to interdisciplinarity, but this competes with the timeline, especially the tenure timeline. So for me, the big question is, if I were a dean, I would be thinking, what kind of work do we really want to be done? What kind of reputation do we really want to have? And then do our evaluative measures match the kind of work that we say we support? And I think that there's room for us to have better conversations and longer conversations about this, about what constitutes a successful scholarly output, but also how do we manage the time that these kinds of projects required. And then the one thing that I'm really questioning, especially after the Capitol insurrection, open source publishing is something that we talk about as a public good, but I'm also not quite sure that certain kinds of research really benefit from having more eyes on them. And I'm still wrestling with this. I can't decide what my answer is to this question, but I do see the way that the far right appropriates knowledge production. And I do worry that a lot of writing about critical race theory, about neoliberal economics, about the right wing, we see it enter into the public sphere in ways that are often counterthetical to what people really were intending to produce as scholars. And so I think that that's something that I would really love to talk with people about, what the benefits, what the disadvantages can be, but also, what it means for scholarship to be really active in taking a political stance. Yeah, so I will actually stop there. I just talked into a void very quickly. I realized that I was going at a strong pace, but I'm hoping that we can share in conversation, if folks want to be promoted, that we can actually have a conversation about some of these things that I brought up, and I'm happy to go back and clarify any of the things that I brought up today.
Thank you very much, Johanna.